It began with the pilots, men hardened by the monotony of long-haul flights across the endless Kazakh steppe, men who swore they knew every trick of light and cloud the sky could offer. Yet even they hesitated before describing what they had seen. A prism of light, rising like a pyramid from the earth below, visible only from the air. The reports began in the early 1960s, whispered at airfields in Almaty and Karaganda, passed like contraband between flight crews over cigarettes and vodka. They spoke of a structure that gleamed in the night like glass catching the sun, yet vanished when searched for on the ground. The first known account surfaces in a declassified Aeroflot log from 1962. A Tu-104 jet en route from Moscow to Alma-Ata reported a luminous geometric projection near the Betpak Dala Desert. The pilot, Captain V. Malishev, noted that the object appeared as a triangular base rising into a radiant apex, visible for several minutes before fading. Air traffic controllers dismissed it as atmospheric refraction, but Malishev wrote in his private journal, later seized by the KGB, it was not the sky, it was on the ground, a pyramid made of light. His journal ends abruptly weeks later, with torn pages suggesting removal. Soon other pilots added their voices. A military transport crew claimed that during a night flight over Semipalatinsk, they saw the prism flare beneath them, a perfect tetrahedron of radiance, so brilliant it cast shadows inside the cabin. They circled twice, recording coordinates. But when a ground reconnaissance team arrived days later, they found nothing but steppe, flat, featureless, empty. Yet their compasses spun wildly within a 2-kilometer radius, and a camera lens cracked without impact, as though stressed by invisible force. The photographs returned blank, overexposed sheets of light. The incident was buried in restricted files labeled simply, "Optical illusion not to be pursued," but pursuit was inevitable. By the mid-1960s, the phenomenon had acquired a code name, Kazakh Prism, the Kazakh Prism. Within the military and scientific apparatus of the Soviet Union, the prism was treated as both threat and opportunity. Was it a natural electromagnetic effect, a weapon of foreign design, or something older still? One internal memorandum compares it to the geoglyphs of unknown origin rumored in Central Asia. Another links it to seismic anomalies near former Gulag sites. Whatever it was, it resisted capture. Local villagers had their own explanations, older than the Soviet state. Folklore from the desert tribes spoke of a mountain of fire that rose during storms, a structure that lured travelers away from their path. Legends described men walking toward it, hypnotized, only to vanish into the night. Through the late 1960s, the prism remained a riddle passed in whispers between pilots who trusted each other more than their superiors. To speak openly invited ridicule, worse, interrogation. Yet the stories multiplied. An MiG-21 flight over the Karaganda training grounds recorded sudden static across all communications. The pilot, Lieutenant Sokolov, later confessed privately to his wingman that he had seen a crystalline pyramid of light rising from the earth, brighter than flares, steady as stone. His wingman admitted he saw nothing. The official report lists only radio malfunction. But Sokolov's logbook, later recovered in fragments, repeats the same phrase scrawled across 3 pages. It was there. It was real. The ground told no such story. Reconnaissance teams combed the coordinates, finding nothing but endless steppe. Yet instruments betrayed subtle traces, erratic compass bearings, sudden surges on magnetometers, camera film fogged without exposure. One team reported finding a patch of scorched grass in a perfect equilateral triangle, edges sharp as though cut with a blade. Samples were collected, but the soil was later declared misfiled. The men involved were reassigned to distant postings. One was found dead months later, officially from exposure, though his colleagues whispered he had been obsessed with the prism until the end. Villagers nearest to the supposed sites spoke of strange nights when the stars dimmed as if drowned by some hidden light. They told stories of livestock that wandered into the desert and never returned, of children who claimed to see shining mountains where only flat earth stretched for miles. A Kazakh elder recounted that his father had seen the prism once during a sandstorm, a pyramid of fire so tall it pierced the clouds. But when he walked toward it, the world bent away from him, and by dawn there was only dust. He insisted the phenomenon was not new, not Soviet, but ancient, older than the steppe itself. The KGB treated such folklore as dangerous contamination. In 1970, a classified directive ordered that all references to phantom structures in Kazakh regions be purged from local records. Teachers were instructed to denounce such tales as primitive superstition. Still, the files filled with contradictions. A military reconnaissance plane, photographing the Semipalatinsk test site, captured a frame streaked with a luminous triangle. Analysts dismissed it as film damage, yet the negative revealed sharp, symmetrical edges, inconsistent with error. A notation in the margin, written by hand, reads, "Matches prior pilot testimonies. Do not circulate." Even within the scientific establishment, voices of doubt emerged. An astrophysicist stationed at Baikonur admitted in a confidential note that several cosmonaut trainees had seen the prism during high-altitude flights. They described it as geometrically perfect, like a prism refracting invisible light. One cadet insisted he saw faint silhouettes moving inside it, like figures frozen in glass. His account was stricken from the official record. His future in the space program quietly ended. Yet among his peers, the story spread, acquiring the weight of legend, that the prism was not merely seen, but inhabited. By 1972, the phenomenon had acquired a deeper layer of fear. An Antonov cargo crew reported that their instruments froze completely as they passed over a suspected site. Altitude, speed, and compass needles locked in place, as if time itself had halted inside the cockpit. For 3 minutes they drifted, powerless, until the system suddenly rebooted. When they landed, they found their watches showed different times, each one running behind by hours. The flight report was confiscated immediately. The men were separated, interrogated, warned never to discuss it again. But the steppe itself carried memory. Travelers passing through regions around Betpak Dala described unease, nausea, migraines that faded the moment they left. Geologists noted strange crystalline deposits beneath the soil, lattice-like structures that did not fit the surrounding geology. In one censored paper, a researcher dared to suggest that the land itself is refracting something unseen, creating the illusion of architecture. He was removed from his institute within months, his name erased from records. The prism remained untouchable, elusive, existing only in contradictions, radiant but invisible, geometric yet untraceable, present only to those who rose above the earth. Pilots who saw it could not prove it. Ground teams who sought it found nothing. The state insisted it was a mirage, a trick of atmosphere. Yet the files swelled with maps marked by hand, testimonies buried under red stamps, and fragments of evidence that refused to vanish. And through all this, one truth became undeniable. The prism could not be summoned, controlled, or predicted. It chose its witnesses, and those who saw it carried the vision like a scar, unable to forget the impossible sight of a pyramid of light rising from the Kazakh earth, brilliant and silent, only to dissolve when touched. By the mid-1970s, the Kazakh Prism had become one of those secrets that stalked the corridors of power, but never appeared in official ledgers. It lived in sealed envelopes, in restricted files stamped with crimson ink, in the briefcases of KGB officers who carried them like poison. Even among those tasked with studying it, the phenomenon was described in careful euphemisms: optical interference, geomagnetic distortion, false illumination. But the men who had seen it firsthand used different words. They spoke of geometry too perfect to be natural, of light too steady to be atmospheric, of a pyramid that was there and then was not. A series of reports from 1974, preserved only in fragments, detail a joint operation between the Ministry of Defense and the Academy of Sciences. A reconnaissance jet equipped with experimental cameras was ordered to fly repeated circuits over coordinates in the Betpak Dala Desert, where multiple sightings had been logged. On the third pass, the cameras captured something remarkable: frames of light forming a perfect triangular base rising into a crystalline point. The images, though blurred, show no clouds, no lens flares, only a stark geometry glowing against the night. Yet when ground teams arrived hours later, there was nothing. The photographs were classified, filed away under the rubric of false positives. But a handwritten note survives in the margin of the scientist's logbook. If false, then why did we all see it? Witness testimony grew increasingly strange. In one account, a pilot swore that as his aircraft flew above the prism, the world below seemed to tilt, as though the Earth itself bent toward the structure. He described a sensation of being pulled downward, of his instruments struggling against invisible drag. His co-pilot later corroborated only part of his story, admitting to a bright triangular flare, but denying the gravitational pull. Under interrogation, the co-pilot recanted even that, claiming exhaustion. Yet weeks later, both men submitted letters of resignation, citing personal reasons. Folklore around the prism took on a darker hue. Kazakh herders claimed that animals refused to graze near certain patches of steppe, as though sensing something beneath the soil. One tale, collected secretly by ethnographers, tells of a caravan in the 19th century that followed a shining mountain in the desert, believing it a guiding star. By dawn, the mountain had vanished, and so had half the caravan. The survivors insisted the missing had walked into the light. These stories were dismissed as legend, yet their details echoed the pilot's accounts. The prism appearing at night, luring travelers, vanishing by morning. Even official records hinted at disappearances. In 1976, a reconnaissance unit deployed to investigate anomalous lights near Balkhash failed to return. Their vehicles were found days later, engines dead, radios melted, tires intact but unmoving as though anchored. The men were gone. The site was sealed, and the report classified as loss due to desertion. But an internal memorandum from a colonel in Alma-Ata disputes this, noting, "No tracks, no sign of struggle, supplies untouched. They did not leave, they were removed." Scientists began to search for rational explanations. Some argued the prism was a form of atmospheric plasma, akin to ball lightning magnified by unique geological conditions. Others suggested a link to underground military tests, perhaps electromagnetic pulses, refracting into the sky. Yet these theories faltered against the evidence. The geometry was too precise, the appearances too consistent across decades. One physicist, in a suppressed paper, dared to call it a structure in a spectrum not normally visible, refracted only at altitude. He was quietly dismissed from his post. His neighbors later recalled he had become obsessed with glass, covering the windows of his flat in mirrored foil, claiming it would keep the pyramid out. He died in isolation, his notes confiscated. The prism also drew attention from outside Soviet borders. Declassified CIA memos reference phantom pyramids reported by Western pilots flying near Kazakh airspace in the late 1970s. One pilot, interviewed years later, described seeing a structure of light so sharp it looked carved from crystal, but when I checked again, there was nothing but desert. The Americans speculated about Soviet radar experiments, but one chilling line in the memo stands out. If this is man-made, then the Soviets have built something the world cannot comprehend. If not, then something else has. By the decade's end, the prism had been folded into the Soviet Union's ever-growing catalog of anomalies, alongside Tunguska, Dyatlov, and whispers of weapons too secret to name. Yet what set the prism apart was its refusal to leave behind proof. No fragments, no debris, no physical trace, only blank photographs, corrupted tapes, soil samples fused with glass-like structures, and the haunted testimonies of those who had seen it. For the men in power, this absence was both a shield and a terror. Absence could be denied, buried, erased, but it also could not be controlled. The prism belonged to no program, no doctrine, no file that could be closed. It appeared when it chose, showed itself to whom it wished, and left nothing but silence. And in that silence, the fear grew. Not that the prism was a Soviet secret too dangerous to reveal, but that it was no Soviet secret at all. That it had been here before the state, before the gulags, before the steppe was mapped, blooming in the night for anyone who dared to look down from above. By 1978, the Kazakh Prism had become a forbidden subject in every official channel, yet the number of reports only multiplied. The more the state sought to strangle it in silence, the more insistent its presence became. Pilots who once spoke cautiously in backrooms began keeping private logs, notebooks filled with sketches of glowing triangles rising from the steppe. Engineers passed rumors in coded phrases: the glass mountain, the mirror in the desert, whenever another instrument failure occurred, and in villages scattered across Central Asia, the old legends took on new weight, for the people had always known what the papers refused to admit. Something walked the land at night, and it showed itself only to those suspended between earth and sky. One of the most disturbing accounts comes from an Aeroflot flight in 1979. At 3:42 a.m., en route from Moscow to Tashkent, the crew reported the sudden appearance of a radiant pyramid directly below their course, so luminous it seemed to refract the stars themselves. Passengers in the cabin began to murmur, some pointing out the windows. Then the lights flickered and silence fell. Total silence. The engines still spun, but no sound reached the ears. The captain wrote later that he could hear his own heartbeat louder than the turbines. The prism grew brighter, so brilliant that shadows of the passengers were cast against the cabin walls, elongated and trembling. And then, as dawn began to creep over the horizon, the structure dissolved like a reflection breaking in water. The passengers, unnerved, were told they had witnessed auroral activity. Yet multiple diaries recovered from travelers on that flight repeat the same detail. For minutes after the prism vanished, their watches stopped. Time itself had stuttered. On the ground, investigations were stepped up. KGB operatives were dispatched to hot zones, where coordinates intersected with repeated sightings. They arrived with seismographs, Geiger counters, magnetometers, only to find readings spiking wildly and inconsistently. Cameras jammed. Film emerged white as if overexposed. One file mentions a portable generator ceasing function as though drained. The officers themselves began to report strange effects: nausea, disorientation, and in one case, hearing voices in languages they could not recognize. A transcript, hastily taken from a disoriented sergeant, records him whispering, "They are inside it. They are still inside." His testimony was stricken from the file, marked delirium, but the page remained, torn and reattached, stained with sweat. Disappearances shadowed the phenomenon. A group of cartographers sent to survey an area near Lake Balkhash failed to return in 1980. Their tent was discovered intact, equipment neatly packed, notebooks left open on unfinished sketches of topographic lines. But in one notebook, a final sketch shows a triangle of light rising from the earth, surrounded by illegible scribbles. The men were declared lost in terrain. Families were instructed not to pursue the matter. Quietly, however, rumors spread that they had walked into the prism itself, that once one entered, there was no coming back. Among the scientific elite, explanations grew more dangerous. One physicist at Alma-Ata suggested in a confidential seminar that the prism was a higher dimensional structure intersecting briefly with our plane. He compared it to a crystal catching light from angles invisible to human eyes. We see only its shadow, he argued, the outline of something larger than we can measure. Days later, his institute denied he had ever presented such a paper. His colleagues, when questioned, swore they remembered nothing. Yet in the drawer of his abandoned office, a sketch remained, a pyramid drawn inside a larger unseen shape, annotated with a single word, gate. The military feared a foreign hand. Reports circulated that American reconnaissance flights near the Kazakh steppe had noted similar anomalies, though the details were never shared. Some officers insisted the prism was a radar trick, a projection from satellites, perhaps even a psychological weapon. But others knew the truth. No foreign power could plant legends centuries old in the mouths of Kazakh shepherds. No foreign engineer could leave circles of scorched earth where no plane had flown. The prism obeyed no human agenda. And yet, the Soviet Union could not resist trying to control it. A special project, rumored to be under the direction of the Ministry of Media Machine Building, attempted to replicate the prism in laboratory conditions. Experiments with lasers, prisms of quartz, and high-frequency resonance were conducted in sealed bunkers near Semipalatinsk. None succeeded. Witnesses from these tests later spoke of failures that bordered on catastrophe. Beams of light bending at impossible angles, instruments recording negative energy values, metal panels warping as if pulled by invisible pressure. One technician, before being silenced, wrote that during one experiment he saw a pyramid of fire blooming on the wall, but it was not on the wall, it was behind it. The tests were abandoned. The project was erased. But the prism continued to bloom on its own, indifferent. Local folklore adapted once more. Travelers began to describe the prism as a mirror mountain, claiming it showed those who gazed upon it not the world around them, but the world they were meant to enter. One story tells of a group of hunters who camped near Betpak Dala, only to find themselves surrounded at night by a silent pyramid of light. They described figures walking within, their own silhouettes, doubled and warped. By dawn, the hunters remained, but they had changed. One man refused to speak ever again. Another walked into the desert barefoot and was never found. The last survived, but when asked about the experience, he replied only, "We were reflected, but the reflection wanted to stay." By 1982, the prism was considered too volatile to ignore, yet too elusive to control. Entire sections of classified reports were dedicated to debunking it, not through science, but through erasure. Pages marked mirage, optical trick, psychological contamination. Yet the witnesses kept coming, pilots who resigned rather than lie, villagers who swore they saw a pyramid shimmer on the horizon, scientists who lost everything after daring to name it. And in that uneasy silence, one terrifying question lingered in the minds of those who knew. Was the Kazakh Prism not just a phenomenon, but a place? If so, then where did it truly exist? On the ground, unseen by human eyes, or in some layer of reality that brushed against ours only for moments at a time, visible only from the sky? The answers never came. The prism appeared. It vanished. It erased those who sought it. And each time it returned, it seemed less like an illusion and more like a reminder, a geometry of light that belonged to no empire, no science, no human hand, a structure that refused to be found, but refused also to be forgotten. By the middle of the 1980s, the prism had taken on the weight of a forbidden riddle that no one in authority could solve, yet no one dared to leave untouched. The more the Union staggered under economic strain and military overreach, the more frantic became its quiet attempts to classify, replicate, or destroy whatever force animated those pyramids of light. It had slipped beyond the boundaries of folklore and rumor. By now it was an internal threat, an anomaly gnawing at the very foundations of the Soviet obsession with control. In 1984, a file circulated among select members of the Air Defense Forces describes an incident involving a regiment of MiG-25 interceptors scrambled near Karaganda after radar operators reported vertical luminous interference. 3 pilots later testified that, as they banked over the target coordinates, a massive prism of white-blue light rose beneath them, stretching upward into a sharp apex that seemed to pierce the night sky. One pilot, Major Abramov, reported that the canopy of his jet glowed from inside as if struck by invisible lightning. He swore the prism was not merely light. It cast reflections of their own aircraft flying inverted, trailing them in silence. When the formation landed, their onboard film cameras were found melted, reels fused into black clumps as though exposed to fire. The official debrief concluded, "No visual target, atmospheric disturbance." Abramov resigned 3 months later, citing personal health, though colleagues whispered he had stopped speaking altogether, scribbling only triangles in his notebooks. Meanwhile, ground teams tasked with investigating these coordinates began returning altered, or not at all. A convoy of trucks carrying seismographic equipment vanished en route to a suspected site near Betpak Dala. The vehicles were discovered weeks later, neatly parked in a line, doors open, engines intact but drained of fuel. The men were gone. Inside one cab, investigators found a half-burned notebook containing sketches of a pyramid divided into transparent layers, annotated with words like corridors, rooms, and inhabitants. The page ended with a sentence scrawled so violently the paper tore. They looked back. Families were told the men had deserted. Their names vanished from public records. Folklore merged eerily with fact. Villagers in the Semipalatinsk region spoke of nights when the horizon erupted in pale fire, like a mountain of glass rising from the ground. Shepherds whispered that those who stared too long into the light became hollow, their voices echoing as though spoken from a cave. Children were told never to chase the glow, never to follow the glass road that sometimes shimmered across the steppe. An old Kazakh woman, interviewed secretly by a student in 1985, described watching the prism bloom during a storm. She claimed she saw her dead husband's face inside it, tilted like in broken glass. When asked if she was afraid, she said softly, "It was not him. It was something that remembered him." The military's own files began to admit what had once been unthinkable, that the prism was not random. Patterns were emerging. The appearances clustered around certain coordinates: abandoned gulag camps, mining sites closed after accidents, and regions marked in older maps as uninhabitable. Analysts began to suspect a connection between buried histories and luminous architecture. One memorandum even proposed that the prism was a projection of accumulated trauma in the landscape. It was ridiculed and suppressed. Yet in the margins of that same memo, someone had underlined the phrase and written a single word: yes. Then came 1986. The Chernobyl disaster reshaped the very landscape of Soviet secrecy. Yet within weeks of the meltdown, rumors spread that pilots ferrying supplies over the exclusion zone reported seeing not one, but 3 prisms of light standing in alignment over the poisoned forests. These accounts never reached the press, but among the military, the whispers were poisonous. If the prisms appeared over Chernobyl, then they were no myth. They were real, and they were drawn to catastrophe. A classified note from that period warns, "These structures are attracted to zones of high energy release, natural or artificial. They may not be passive." The line was struck out in later copies, but the original survives in a photocopy smuggled to Novosibirsk University in the 1990s. The obsession to understand the prism deepened. Scientists were ordered to devise experiments in controlled observation. In 1987, a team was flown to a high plateau near Balkhash, with orders to remain on site for a month using experimental infrared cameras. For weeks, they recorded nothing. Then one night, the cameras picked up a triangular flare of heat rising from the desert floor, reaching into the upper atmosphere. The team described hearing a low resonance, like a choir underwater, that vibrated through their bones. One researcher, unable to sleep afterward, scribbled in his diary, "It is not light, it is structure, a building of another spectrum." Days later, the entire team was recalled abruptly, their equipment confiscated, their notes destroyed. Only fragments of their diaries survive, smuggled out by a young assistant who fled to Europe after the collapse. By the late 1980s, the prism had slipped into the bloodstream of rumor across the Union. It was whispered in factory dormitories, in barracks, in student hostels. Some claimed it was a Soviet weapon gone wrong, others that it was a message from extraterrestrials. But in certain villages, people still called it what they always had: the glass mountain, the mirror pyramid, the tomb of light. And for those who had seen it, none of the explanations mattered. What mattered was the silence that followed, the way sound itself seemed to drain when the prism bloomed, leaving only the deafening hum of something vast and alien pressing against the world. And always the same final detail: when dawn came, it was gone. No ruins, no shadow. Only the memory, lingering in the bones of those who saw it, like frost that never melts. As the 1980s staggered toward their end, the prism became less an anomaly and more a haunting presence stitched into the unraveling fabric of the Soviet Union. Files multiplied, each one denser with contradictions than the last. Pilots swore they saw it. Ground patrols swore they did not. Villagers whispered of nights when the desert itself glowed, while officials insisted nothing unusual had occurred. Yet beneath the silence of denials, the number of vanished men and aborted missions grew. The prism did not leave behind debris or ruins, only absences, as though it consumed not objects, but records, not bodies, but certainty. In 1988, a transport plane carrying medical supplies over Kazakhstan reported the appearance of a radiant triangle directly beneath their course. The crew later described the structure as colossal, rising higher than the clouds, its sides refracting stars into strange patterns. One nurse on board claimed she saw silhouettes moving within the light, rows of figures standing as if in formation. The flight landed safely, but every roll of film brought back by the crew was blank, as if exposed to a blinding flash. The official file lists false celestial reflection, yet the captain's private notebook, later confiscated, ends with a chilling line: "They were waiting for us." Disappearances became harder to explain away. A meteorological team dispatched to study unusual atmospheric inversions near Semipalatinsk never returned. Their equipment was found neatly stacked, radios still powered, food untouched. In one tent lay a notebook with sketches of a pyramid rising from concentric rings of fire. The page ends mid-sentence. "We entered." Families were told the men had been lost in a snowstorm, but locals whispered they had been taken into the prism. As Glasnost cracked open the facade of secrecy, journalists tried to follow the trail. A young reporter from Alma-Ata gathered testimonies from retired pilots who had seen the prism in the 1960s and 70s. He compiled their accounts into a draft article describing a pyramid of light that blooms in the desert. Before it could be published, he died in a car crash on the outskirts of the city. His notes disappeared from his apartment. Colleagues claimed not to have known him, yet in the margins of a surviving draft, a handwritten phrase remains: "Not illusion, not Soviet, something else." Folklore grew sharper as the empire faltered. Old herders said the prism had been here long before Moscow claimed the steppe, that it bloomed when the earth was wounded, feeding on fire and silence. Young men whispered that the gulags had been built where the prism appeared most often, that Stalin himself had known and sought to harness it. Others said it was no structure at all, but a doorway, one that opened only at night, showing itself to those suspended between worlds. By the collapse of 1991, the Kazakh Prism was no longer even a subject of study. The institutes that once filed reports were dismantled, the officers reassigned, the archives scattered or burned. But the phenomenon did not vanish with the state that tried to contain it. It remained in the desert, in the air above the steppe, in the memories of those who had seen its impossible geometry. And as the Soviet Union crumbled into silence, the prism remained exactly what it had always been: something radiant, unreachable, and unyielding, rising from the earth for a single night and then withering into nothing before dawn. The 1990s were supposed to erase such mysteries, but the prism refused to be buried alongside the empire that had tried to conceal it. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rigid mechanisms of silence cracked open. Files once locked in steel cabinets were sold on the black market. Notebooks stolen from abandoned institutes turned up in flea markets, and stories that had been punishable by prison suddenly spilled into open air. For the first time, the Kazakh Prism entered common speech, not as a state secret, but as a rumor no longer confined to barracks or village firesides. Yet freedom did not bring clarity. It brought only more confusion, as the fragments contradicted one another, each pointing to something more vast and more impossible than the last. In 1992, pilots from a newly privatized airline reported the sudden blooming of a luminous pyramid while flying between Astana and Tashkent. Unlike older accounts, they claimed the prism was accompanied by a deep vibration that rattled the fuselage and silenced all radio transmissions. The passengers grew restless as the plane trembled, yet none of them saw the light, only the crew, who later swore they watched the desert split into refracted colors, as if the ground itself had turned to glass. Investigators chalked the incident up to turbulence, but a mechanic who inspected the aircraft noted that the exterior paint had blistered in triangular patches. He wrote his findings in a report that never reached publication. Within months, he left Kazakhstan altogether. Villagers began to connect new disappearances to the old stories. Shepherds in the Betpak Dala desert spoke of hearing a low hum in the night, followed by a glow rising over the horizon. In the morning, a herd of goats was gone, leaving only a circle of scorched earth. Locals claimed the animals had walked into the glass mountain. Truckers crossing the steppe told of headlights suddenly refracting into dozens of beams, as though passing through an invisible prism. Some refused to drive those routes at night, muttering that the road itself bent when the pyramid rose. Journalists, hungry for forbidden stories in the post-Soviet vacuum, tried to investigate. In 1994, a Moscow weekly ran an article titled "The Phantom Pyramid of Kazakhstan." It compiled testimonies from pilots, villagers, and former KGB men. The piece suggested the prism might be a projection of unknown origin, possibly natural, possibly not. Days after publication, the paper's office was broken into. Files were stolen, hard drives smashed, and the editor-in-chief resigned under mysterious circumstances. Copies of the issue were seized from kiosks, but not before thousands had read it. For years afterward, the story circulated underground, passed from hand to hand in photocopies, fueling even wilder theories. Scientists tried to reclaim control of the narrative. A group of physicists from Novosibirsk proposed that the prism was the result of seismic piezoelectric discharges, giant bursts of light created by pressure on crystalline rock. Their paper was dismissed by colleagues who noted that the sightings were too geometric, too consistent, too deliberate. Another group suggested it was connected to Cold War experiments with high-energy lasers. Yet no device on Earth could project an image seen only from the sky, invisible to those standing beneath it. By the end of the decade, the prism had transformed into something larger than a phenomenon. It became a symbol of the Soviet past, its secrecy, its obsession with control, its erasures. In Almaty, whispered tales linked it to Gulag sites still unmarked by memorials, claiming the prisms rose where the dead were restless. In villages, old men insisted it was no Soviet secret at all but a wound in the earth, showing itself only when the land could no longer contain its silence. And yet, in spite of new openness, the prism remained as elusive as ever. It left behind no wreckage, no verifiable images, no solid evidence, only scorched soil, blank photographs, and the hollow testimonies of those who swore they had seen its radiant geometry. The new governments were as powerless as the old. The files scattered, the investigators disappeared, and the desert remained unchanged. The Kazakh Prism was no longer a Soviet mystery, but something older and colder, something that survived the empire's collapse without effort. And for those who looked out of airplane windows on winter nights, it remained what it had always been, a pyramid of light blooming in silence, daring the living to admit that it existed. By the early 2000s, the prism had become a ghost threaded through the new language of the post-Soviet world. Part conspiracy, part folklore, part scientific puzzle that no one could fully dismiss. The chaos of transition years had scattered the files, but scattered too were the people. Pilots, scientists, soldiers, each carrying fragments of memory like shards of broken glass. When the internet seeped into Central Asia, the prism took on a second life in forums and message boards, where anonymous voices claimed sightings and shared coordinates as though exchanging contraband. There, the phenomenon escaped the grip of secrecy altogether, yet what emerged was not clarity, but a deeper fog. In 2001, a Kazakh cargo pilot reported seeing a pyramid of light bloom beneath him while approaching Almaty. His testimony, posted later under a pseudonym, described the structure as an immense crystalline mountain, transparent yet radiant, refracting the city lights into patterns I could not understand. He claimed that when he banked away, the horizon bent unnaturally, as if the desert below folded around the prism. The airliner landed without incident, but he resigned weeks later, citing nightmares. In an online forum, he wrote his final entry, "It was not on the ground, it was inside the air itself." He vanished from public records soon after. Villagers continued to tell quieter, more frightening stories. Herdsmen in the Karaganda region claimed that during certain winters, the night sky itself seemed to fracture, casting triangular shadows onto the snow. Hunters near Betpak Dala whispered that their rifles jammed when pointed toward the glow, as if metal refused to acknowledge the prism's existence. Some swore they saw animals, wolves, horses, standing motionless at the edge of the light, staring into it until dawn, then vanishing completely. One herder who witnessed this swore he later heard the voices of the animals calling his name in dreams, distorted as if through water. Researchers tried to capture it with new technology. In 2004, a team from Astana equipped with digital cameras and thermal sensors camped near a site of repeated sightings. They reported nothing visible with the naked eye. Yet the thermal cameras recorded a perfect triangular flare of heat, rising hundreds of meters above the desert floor, vanishing at dawn. When the data was reviewed, the files corrupted themselves, looping the same second of static over and over. A technician claimed to have heard whispers in the static, "Closer, closer." The team disbanded, their funding cut. The Institute declared the experiment inconclusive. As years passed, the prism seeped into the cultural bloodstream. Documentaries on late-night television hinted at phantom pyramids in Kazakhstan, mixing stock footage of deserts with dramatic narration, always ending in ambiguity. In Almaty, urban legends linked the prism to vanished prisoners of Soviet times, insisting their shadows were trapped in the light. On the internet, theories multiplied. Some claimed it was a Soviet weapon buried beneath the steppe. Others argued it was a natural dimensional rift, a mirror mountain that refracted not light, but entire worlds. Few agreed, but none could deny the persistence of sightings. And then came 2006. A group of students hiking near Lake Balkhash posted a shaky video online showing a distant glow in the shape of a triangle. The image is indistinct, pixelated, yet chilling. As they laugh nervously, the sound cuts, leaving only a deep resonance that vibrates the microphone. The video ends abruptly. The students never returned from their trip. Authorities searched and found only their tent and backpacks in a neat circle. The case was ruled accidental drowning, though their bodies were never recovered. The video disappeared from the web within days, though copies still circulate in hidden corners, a grainy echo of the prism's silence. By the close of the decade, the Kazakh Prism stood as one of those mysteries that refused both capture and dismissal. It belonged to no state, no science, no generation. Whether spoken in the frightened voice of a villager written in the clipped reports of a pilot or flickering on the pixelated screens of the internet, it remained unchanged. A pyramid of light that rose where nothing should, visible only for those suspended between earth and sky. And when dawn came, it was gone, leaving only silence and the memory of an architecture that should not exist. The second decade of the 21st century brought new eyes, new technologies, and new ambitions to map every corner of the Earth. Satellites swept across Kazakhstan with lenses sharp enough to see individual stones. GPS charted every valley and ridge. Drones soared over deserts once thought unreachable. Yet in spite of all this, the Kazakh Prism remained what it had always been, a structure of light that appeared only when it chose, only for those it allowed to see it, and left no trace when the searchers came with their machines. In 2011, a commercial flight from Frankfurt to Beijing reported unusual turbulence over the Kazakh steppe. Passengers later described seeing strange refractions flicker across the windows, as though the night air had turned to glass. One man swore he saw a pyramid of pure light, immense and sharp-edged, hovering beneath the plane. Others claimed they saw nothing at all, yet when the aircraft landed, its navigation system showed 3 minutes of missing data. Engineers dismissed it as a glitch. The passengers, interviewed separately, contradicted each other so completely that their testimonies canceled themselves out. But one diary, later leaked online, contained a line written in frantic handwriting. "It was not beneath us, it was around us." In 2014, a Kazakh geologist named Bekjanov led a small team into the Bet-Pak Dala desert with satellite imaging drones, determined to settle the mystery. For days, they recorded nothing. Then, one night, their drones caught an image of a perfect triangular flare rising from the ground. The footage shows a translucent structure, glowing faintly, refracting the starlight into shifting colors. Seconds later, the feed cut to static. When the team reached the coordinates on foot, they found scorched soil in triangular patterns, warm to the touch though the air was freezing. One researcher collapsed, clutching his head, whispering that he could hear voices. By morning he was gone, vanished from his tent without leaving footprints. The rest of the team abandoned the mission, their report dismissed as equipment malfunction. But Bekjanov never returned to the field. His last notebook contains a single phrase repeated across multiple pages: "It listens, it waits." Local witnesses began to notice a disturbing pattern. The prism seemed to appear more often near sites of industrial catastrophe, abandoned mines, chemical spills, places where the land itself had been broken. Shepherds told of nights when the ground glowed faintly and livestock refused to move. One described a herd of horses frozen in place, staring at an invisible point on the horizon. When he tried to lead them away, they resisted until dawn, when suddenly they bolted as though freed from an unseen tether. The shepherd later confessed that for those hours he felt his own thoughts echoing back to him, as if spoken by another voice. Meanwhile, fragments of Soviet files continued to surface in online archives. A set of scanned documents released anonymously in 2016 described a project codenamed Zerkalo, Mirror. The paper suggests that in the 1980s, Soviet scientists attempted to build an artificial prism using lasers and crystal arrays, hoping to replicate the phenomenon in controlled conditions. The experiments ended in unexplained failures. Light bending at impossible angles, instruments recording negative values, metal walls shimmering as though half-transparent. One chilling note reads, "We do not build it. It builds itself when we wound the land deeply enough." Whether authentic or forged, the documents reignited the debate. Some argued the Soviets had indeed tried to capture the prism. Others believed the papers were disinformation to cover up something darker. Witnesses continued to vanish. In 2018, 2 hikers exploring near Lake Balkhash transmitted a shortwave radio message to friends. "We see it. A pyramid, black and bright, both at once." Minutes later, contact was lost. Their bodies were never recovered. Authorities claimed a storm had swept the region, but weather records show clear skies. The only evidence left behind was a GPS tracker that showed the hikers walking in a straight line toward an unmarked point in the desert, then stopping abruptly, as if swallowed whole. By now, the Prism had become a subject of international rumor. Online communities tracked supposed sightings, mapping them onto satellite images. Some claimed the locations formed geometric patterns across Central Asia, intersecting with ancient burial sites, gulag ruins, and abandoned test ranges. Others pointed out that the sightings often coincided with seismic activity, as though the Earth itself was producing the geometry. Yet none of these maps could predict when or where the prism would appear. It emerged without warning, at night, and always dissolved by dawn. The Kazakh government denied all knowledge, insisting no such phenomenon existed. Yet villagers still whispered of glowing nights. Pilots still spoke cautiously of sudden silences in the sky, and investigators still turned up missing. In 2019, a French documentary crew traveled to the steppe, hoping to capture footage. Their cameras recorded nothing unusual, but the sound files, every one, were corrupted by a low resonant hum, identical in pitch, identical in duration, lasting precisely 7 minutes. On the last tape, just before the hum ends, a faint voice can be heard, "Not yours." The documentary was never released. By the end of the decade, the prism remained what it had always been: luminous, geometric, and unreachable. It had survived the fall of the Soviet Union, the opening of archives, the rise of satellites, and the internet. It defied explanation, leaving behind only scorched soil, missing people, blank photographs, and testimonies that collapsed under contradiction. It existed everywhere and nowhere, hidden in the sky, blooming from the earth, refusing to be pinned down. And for those who had seen it, one fact was inescapable: the prism was not fading with time. If anything, it was growing bolder, showing itself more often, to more witnesses, with stranger effects. It had become less a secret, and more a presence, waiting just beyond the reach of certainty, daring the living to believe in its silent geometry. No matter how deep the investigations went, the same chilling truth always returned. The prism did not want to be found on the ground. It wanted to be seen from above, suspended, fleeting, and untouchable. And each time it appeared, it left the same question echoing in the silence it created. Was it warning humanity away, or inviting us closer? By the 2020s, the prism had slipped beyond the reach of any single explanation. Governments denied it, scientists avoided it, journalists romanticized it, and locals treated it as a ghost woven into the land itself. Yet no matter how many labels were applied, mirage, anomaly, legend, the sightings never ceased. What unnerved researchers most was not the absence of evidence, but the persistence of memory. Too many unrelated witnesses, separated by decades and ideology, described the same impossible geometry: a pyramid of light, perfect and silent, blooming on the Kazakh steppe, only to vanish before dawn. New technologies brought no resolution. Drones sent to chase reports found nothing but frozen deserts and blank skies. Satellites captured occasional flares, triangular distortions, and infrared scans, but nothing solid enough to publish. One European research team that tried to analyze these distortions noted in their final report, "Every pattern breaks upon approach. The closer we look, the less there is to see." Their data ended abruptly in corrupted files filled with repeating binary sequences that, when translated, produced the word otrogenia, reflection. Folklore deepened in parallel with science's failure. Villagers in the regions of Karaganda and Betpakdala began calling the prism the silent mirror, saying it appeared when the earth was restless, when storms gathered underground instead of in the sky. Some claimed the Soviets had tried to bury it by building gulags on its sites, feeding it human suffering. Others whispered it was never of this earth, that it was a doorway glimpsed only from above because what lay beyond did not belong to the ground at all. A shepherd's son, interviewed in 2021, described a night when he saw a black pyramid rise in silence from the desert floor, its edges lined in radiant fire. When asked what it felt like, he said, "Like being watched by your own shadow." Disappearance cases continued, even in modern times. A pair of foreign researchers equipped with thermal cameras and GPS trackers vanished during an expedition near Lake Balkhash in 2022. Their tent was found, neatly arranged, equipment intact. Their laptops contained corrupted video files filled with triangular flares, frames looping endlessly in silence. The final GPS log showed them walking directly toward a point in the desert, then stopping mid-stride. Their bodies were never recovered. Authorities blamed dehydration. Locals shook their heads and said, "The glass mountain opened." What disturbed investigators most was the prism's indifference. Unlike weapons or experiments, it served no obvious purpose. It did not announce itself, did not demand worship, did not even always take the same form. Sometimes radiant, sometimes black, sometimes translucent as water, sometimes sharp enough to cut the stars, yet always triangular, always geometric, always fleeting. Its silence was its most terrifying trait. No matter how many witnesses swore to its existence, it never spoke, never explained, never left behind anything but scorched soil and hollow memory. And so the prism became less a mystery of physics than of perception. Was it real, or was it a mirror of the mind, reflecting what those who saw it most feared? The Soviets had tried to label it, control it, bury it. Post-Soviet governments ignored it. Scientists argued over it. Villagers accepted it. And still it appeared, generation after generation, as if to prove that denial was irrelevant. Perhaps it was a Soviet experiment, an optical weapon abandoned when it could not be controlled. Perhaps it was a natural anomaly, a strange interplay of geology and atmosphere. Perhaps it was older still, something hidden beneath the steppe long before Moscow or Astana, long before maps or borders, a structure waiting for the sky to notice it. Or perhaps it was none of these, but something that used geometry as camouflage, showing itself only when humanity looked down from above, daring us to admit it was there. And so the question remains, heavier now than ever. What is the Kazakh Prism? A secret erased by collapsing empires? A mirage too persistent to die? Or a reminder that beneath the silence of deserts and the erasures of history, something vast still waits to be seen? The files end in contradiction. The testimonies collapse into silence. The photographs come back blank. Only the stories remain, carried across decades, across borders, across the fading memory of those who once glimpsed the impossible. And in that silence, one last thought lingers. Did the Soviet Union really try to bury a phantom pyramid that never existed on the ground? Or was the story itself a distraction, hiding something far older, far darker, and still watching us from the skies above the steppe?